咁同大家今日分享嘅故事，其實最主要希望成就到一件事情就係、無論大家今晚你嘅掙扎係喺邊一處，係嗰個情形係點樣，大家其實都需要知道一樣嘢咧，就係、你絕對唔係孤單嘅，因為我自己喺過往10年喺不斷嘅唔同嘅場合啦，喺唔同嘅地方唔同嘅城市。咁去不斷分享我經歷過呢個抑鬱症呢個故事。咁我自己除咗有陣時喺教會分享啦，我開我自己嘅音樂會啦。咁我亦都係喺我工作上咧，我係呢個公益金其中一個嘅代言人。咁所以喺好多嘅場合，喺啲嘅一啲嘅公司啊，咁佢哋有啲嘅聚會啊，咁我哋都會入去分享呢個關於呢個心理健康一啲嘅課題。So let me just share a little bit about who I am. Hey, my name is Alfred, if you don't know by now. I worked in a church for over 20 years as a pastor. And I still am a pastor, but for the last 10 years or so, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, serving the community. 咁我係 Alfred 啦，咁我大概咧喺教會服侍咗20年嘅時間㗎啦。咁我其實我自己身份而家都係一個牧師，咁但係喺過往嘅10年呢，就喺呢個非牟利嘅工作上面呢，咁我特別咧喺一間嘅非牟利機構叫做華之處，咁咧就係到為大家去服務嘅。So I'm a writer, I'm a musician, I'm a speaker, I'm an advocate, obviously for mental wellness, and I am an Ironman triathlete. 咁頭先分享過啦，我做好多即係中國人有句説話咧，叫做周身都冇張利。咁你周身都冇張利呢句説話咧，就好貼切咁形容到小弟嘅。咁我又有陣時寫下做下寫作啊，做下音樂啊。咁我亦都係好希望能夠好致力咁樣去喺社區裏邊咧，將呢個心理同埋精神健康呢個信息傳開去。咁咧另外一樣嘢咧，就係我亦都係一個嘅3項鐵人嘅運動員嚟嘅。咁now having said all of that, I think when I speak, I always have trouble introducing myself that way because you see, we have a tendency, or the labels they put on themselves. So we say, well, she is a pastor, he's an engineer, he is a writer, she's the deacon, he's divorced, she's gay. And we put these labels on people. And the problem is that I've discovered in my many years in the church is that as soon as you put a label on a person, what we do next is very damaging. Because what we do next is that we begin to create a story in our heads, and we assume that's who the person is. So for instance, in the church, in my many years, I've worked over 20 years in the church, I've learned that as soon as someone come out and say that I'm divorced, there are a lot of us in the church, as soon as we hear that label, we create this story around this person, and we assume we know this person. But you know, that's human nature. That's not new. In fact, it's as old as the Bible itself, because people in the Bible actually they are obsessed with labels, just like we are. You know, labels like a Jew or Gentile or Pharisee or a Roman or circumcised or adulterer, a king and a prophet. And we see that all over the place in the Bible. But the Bible says to us, none of that matter. None of those labels matter, because none of those labels define you as a person. Your labels don't define you. Your story defines you. 好多時我哋發覺咧，我哋人性嘅關係特別喺教會裏邊，我哋好容易標籤咗一啲嘅人。當我哋將一個標籤擺喺個人嘅身上嘅時候咧，嗰個傷害性係咩？就係我哋繼而咧就會去喺個腦海裏邊咧就去自己作咗一啲嘅故事，就覺得呢個人就係咁樣噶啦。咁但係其實我頭先同大家分享過喺聖經裏邊咧，即係呢個好愛好標籤人呢個嘅習慣，其實喺聖經裏面我哋見到嘅。但係聖經俾我哋一個教導就係，無論你身上面嘅標籤係乜嘢，你係猶太人， 你係外邦人，你受過割禮嘅，你係羅馬人，你係無論你個標籤係咩，呢啲都唔重要，因為你嘅生命嘅定義唔係喺個標籤個書，無論人哋擺乜嘢 label， 人哋擺咩標籤喺你身上都唔重要，你嘅生命嘅定義就係你生命嘅故事。And I hope what at the end of this talk tonight, what I hope I can impress upon you is that you will see less the labels that I wear, and you will see more the story that I'm living. And in turn, that will inspire you to pursue the story that is your life, because that's what's important. To me, that above all else, that is the message of the Bible. Because if I were to sum up the story of the Bible in a few very simple sentences, let me give it a go. Here's what I would say. Sum up the Bible in 5 sentences. Sentence number 1, there is a God. Simple, right? But biblical story, sentence number 1, there is a God. Sentence number 2, you're not him. All right? There's a God, you're not him. Sentence 3, God is working with you right together. Sentence 4, your story that God is writing at the same time. And finally, sentence 5, no matter what happens, please don't quit until you see how your story turns out. So your labels don't define you. Your story defines you. And so let me share with you a little bit about my story. So I live with an illness called depression. Let me give you a few facts about depression, especially in Canada. Roughly 20% of Canadians will personally experience a mental illness at some point in their lifetime. So roughly 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental illness at some point in their lifetime. Now, mental illnesses affects people of all ages, regardless of your age, regardless of your education background, regardless of your income level, regardless of your culture. It hits everybody. Now, here's where it's important for our discussion tonight. In Canada, and actually in much of the Western world, young people between the age of 15 and 24 are more likely to experience a mental illness or substance abuse issue more than any other age group. All right, let me make that clear. In Canada and in much of the Western world, young people between the ages of 15 to 24 are more likely to experience depression or mental illness or substance abuse issue than any other age group. And in Canada, let me conclude the stats with this. In Canada, after accidents like car accidents and household accidents or whatever, after accidents, suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 15 to 24. 呢啲係其實一啲好幾嚴重、幾重要嘅數據，所以我用中文想同大家分享多一次嚇。喺加拿大大概20%嘅人咧，喺佢嘅生命嗰個歷程當中係會經歷到一啲嘅心理病，唔單止係抑鬱症啦嚇，大概每5個人當中有1個人喺佢嘅生命裏邊咧係會經歷到一啲嘅心理病或者嘅精神病。而精神病咧嘅案例，我哋見到咧，其實喺任何嘅歲數啦、任何嘅經濟背景、任何嘅文化背景、任何嘅教育背景，都係會有人經歷到嘅。最重要有2個嘅數據，我想今晚大家好留心去聽嘅就係咧，喺加拿大，其實喺西方國家裏邊咧，15至24歲嘅年青人咧，係比起任何其他嘅歲數嘅組別，係更加高機會去患上心理病嘅。15至24歲患心理病嗰個嘅比率係比其他任何嘅年齡組別係高。同埋喺加拿大，除咗意外之後，意外係咩？即係交通意外啊，喺屋企發生嘅意外啊，嗰類嘅意外啦。 除咗意外之後15%至24%當中嘅人士嘅死亡嘅原因最高係咩呢？係自殺。OK， 咁呢啲係其實係我哋需要去好去正視嘅一啲嘅現實同埋一啲嘅數據。So I was diagnosed with depression about 13 years ago, and at that time I was working as a pastor. Everything was going well. I was fairly successful. I was actually the first English-speaking pastor in Canada to be appointed as a senior pastor of a Chinese church. So life was going well. My work was going well. I was teaching in seminaries. I had finished my doctorate study, and all of a sudden I began to notice something wasn't quite right with me. I would notice that every now and then, for apparently no reason at all, I would be overcome by this deep sense of sadness. And there would be many times when I would finish, working on Sunday, preaching in church or whatever, and I would be out maybe in a shopping mall buying something, running an errand, and all of a sudden I would sit down and I would cry uncontrollably. And I can't, if you were to stop me at that point and ask me, why are you crying? What are you sad about? I couldn't tell you. But I would cry uncontrollably. And to make a long story short, because I want to leave more time for you to ask questions tonight, that condition gradually worsened. And I began not being able to sleep. And I began experiencing this pain in my chest that would start as soon as I opened my eyes in the morning, and it would last all through the day and would stay with me till I fall asleep at night. And I couldn't focus, I couldn't sleep, and I thought, okay, maybe I was just stressed, maybe I was working too hard. But things slowly began to spiral downwards, and one time I was driving, and I was driving on a 401. I can take you back to that exact spot where this happened. I was driving on a 401 one afternoon, and there was this big truck that pulled up beside me, and the two of us were driving side by side. And as I was driving, down the highway, I hear this voice, clear as I'm speaking to you, saying, "You know what, Alfred? If you would just steer your car a little bit that way, the pain would stop." And it took all the willpower that I had on that day to stop myself from steering my car, crashing into this truck to end my life. And at that point, I realized something is terribly wrong, because I've worked so many years as a pastor. I've spent a lot of time counseling people. And I spent a lot of time counseling people that are struggling with suicidal thoughts. And all those years, the one thing I couldn't understand, the one thing I couldn't figure out was, how does someone get to a point in life where death is their best option? I mean, I've counseled many people who struggle with it. I couldn't understand it until I get to that point on the 401 highway on that day, where all of a sudden I realized that I was thinking, you know what, at this point, death is my most attractive option. So I went to see a doctor. The doctor diagnosed me with severe clinical depression, and prescribed medication for me to take, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But my life just spiraled downwards. The pain won't stop. Right? As soon as I open my eyes in the morning to the very last moment until I close my eyes at night, the pain wouldn't stop. And during that part of my life, right, nothing matters. Nothing else matters but to stop the pain. And if I were to offer a little bit of a segue here, I now understand when people who struggle with addiction, behind every addiction, there's a pain that the person is trying to stop. And that was me. And so I began abusing alcohol. I began drinking heavily because that was the only way I could fall asleep at night. And my health fell apart, my marriage fell apart, my life fell apart. It just spiraled downwards from there. And it took me 4 years of counseling and 2 years on medication before I began to slowly piecing my life back together again. 咁頭先我好快咁樣同大家即係一班講英文嘅，我當中講英文嘅朋友分享過啦，咁分享過我自己喺抑鬱症嘅故事啦。咁作為一個牧師，我係直到咧我自己真係想嘗試去自殺，我先至明白到我自己嗰個嘅病嗰個嚴重性。咁我點解我會知道呢？因為作為一個牧師，我做好多輔導嘅工作，咁喺歷年嚟呢，都係幫過好多有自殺傾向嘅朋友。幫過呢啲朋友去做輔導嘅時候，有一點我從來唔能夠明白嘅就係，有乜可能一個人個生命嗰個歷程會去到一點係佢會覺得死亡係佢最好嘅選擇呢？咁直到嗰日我自己揸緊架火車喺我隔離喺高速公路上邊，我好想將架車撞埋架火車度去停止我每日都經歷嗰種嘅痛楚。咁我就知道我係真係有病，咁就去睇醫生。睇醫生之後食藥啦，經過4年嘅輔導嘅接受咗輔導嘅治療，2年嘅藥物。咁喺當中咧嗰個嘅過程咧我把聲唔係好夠大嚇，如果我而家較大1小時，如果再唔夠大聲就麻煩再話俾我知。咁喺當中嗰個過程咧，個生命其實不斷咁樣去崩潰嘅。因為嗰種嘅痛苦啊，我冇辦法只可以停得到。我唯一可以停到就係每日飲醉酒。我係要自己飲到好醉，我先至能夠有機會去到瞓到覺。咁你可以想像我作為一個牧師，禮拜6晚要飲醉酒先瞓到覺，禮拜日朝頭早要去講道。咁你估嗰個嘅，你可以即係可以聯想到或者幻想到嗰個嘅嗰個痛苦係點樣樣。So I entitled this talk, Let There Be Light, because my years of living with depression also happened to be the most eye-opening, revealing, educational, transformational experience of my life. It was through the years of darkness of depression that I saw the light and I see the changes that I need to make in my life. Now, here's the thing about light though. Light is a good thing. Light is important. And I've often said to people, but the one thing we don't realize is that light is only useful if you want to see. Because if you don't want to see, if you want to keep your eyes closed, if you don't want to look at what's around you, if you don't want to look inside and see what is wrong with you and what changes you need to make, if you don't want to see, then light is useless. And for the last number of years, whenever I give a talk like this, and whenever I'm invited to speak on this issue, a lot of people would want to hear the story about how I recovered from depression. And I found that I always have to clarify a couple of things up front. First of all, for those of us who live with mental illness, for those of us who speak on issues of such as depression, we always talk in the present tense. So I have not overcome depression. I have depression. I live with it every single day. Some days are better. Some days are worse. There are good days, there are bad days, and I live accordingly. But what I've learned is that now I learn how to manage it rather than having it manage me. So this is the first thing you need to understand that I have not overcome it. I have not, this is not in my past. I live with it every day. And secondly, I need to point out that I don't talk about recovering from depression because, you see, the word recover is by definition backwards looking, right? It implies that you want to get back to how your life was before depression happened. But my experience and my story is that I am a very different person today than the person that I was before. And I don't want to go back. I don't want to trade that for anything else. I understand life differently. I understand my faith, and I live out my spirituality very differently. I understand what it means to be a Christian very differently than before. I understand my responsibilities in the world differently, and I'm a different person today. And the irony is that the darkness of depression helped to turn on the light for me to see these things. So I don't talk about recovering from depression because I don't think in terms of going backwards. I look at it as what depression has revealed to me and the changes that I need to make going forward. 或者講兩句中文，等大家都明白呢個，我覺得呢個係一個好重要一個點嘅，就係好多時教會喺教會嘅場合啦，咁去邀請我哋分享關於抑鬱症嘅故事嘅時候，咁你知喺教會裏邊好多時有一個嘅習慣咧，就係我哋好想聽見咧，我哋點樣去戰勝咗啲嘅嘢，點樣去克服咗啲嘅嘢嗰啲咧就係以前嘅事啦，過去咗啦，咁感謝主，我而家就冇咗呢個問題啦，咁樣樣，咁我哋覺得呢個咧就係我哋想聽嘅見證。咁但係咧我想同大家首先去指出一樣嘢，就係咧我係冇克服過抑鬱症嘅，抑鬱症係我每日生活嘅一個現實我有抑鬱症。咁但係咧，我而家喺經過呢個過程、經過療程嘅時候，我懂得點樣去 manage 佢讓我懂得點樣去盡我嘅能力去控制佢，唔好讓佢去完全控制我。咁所以呢個係一點好重要嘅，就係如你果從一個信仰嘅角度咧，咁我覺得其實喺信仰角度嚟講，唔係話我哋要一定話啲嘢係過去咗而家冇咁先至叫做一個見證。其實同與神同行好多時嘅時候，都係神係教導我哋，神係幫助我哋喺痛苦之中與佢同行嘅咁所以我哋好多時教會裏邊咧，我哋有一套成功神學嘅觀念即係好想知道即係嗰啲係冇過咗去啦，而家冇啦，而家係點樣？咁但係呢個唔係我嘅經歷。第二樣嘢就好多時教會弟兄姊妹想知道我點樣去喺抑鬱症嘅當中去復原呢個 recover。呢個字我哋亦都好常用咁但係我係唔用呢個，我唔能夠用呢個字去形容我嘅經歷，因為復原嘅意思係乜嘢啊？復原嘅意思就係將你嘅生命翻去以前啊嘛，翻去抑鬱症發生之前係點樣？咁我哋呢個就係我哋理解啲咩叫做復原咧，就係咁。咁但係喺我經歷當中咧，今日嘅我同以前嘅我係一個完全唔同嘅人。喺抑鬱症呢個過程裏面，俾我見到我生命嘅我有一啲嘅 priorities， 有啲嘅先後次序。我對信仰嗰個嘅理解，而家比我以前係好唔同。我對我自己基督徒喺呢個世界裏邊個身份同埋責任係乜嘢，比我以前嘅理解係好唔同。咁所以今日嘅我同之前嘅我係兩個完全唔同嘅人。咁所以我就唔會同朋友話我點樣喺抑鬱症裏邊復原咗，而係咧係抑鬱症俾我開到我嘅眼睛去睇到啲我生命裏邊需要改變嘅地方。咁其實咧呢個喺聖經裏邊咧，你打開第一頁嘅聖經，呢個就係聖經嘅故事啦，係咪啊？That's the story of the Bible, right? Like right from when you begin to turn open that first page. Right? The Bible tells us this is the story, right? God created heaven and earth, And then what does it say? It says, now there was darkness. The earth was formless. There was emptiness. And out of that darkness and emptiness and formlessness, God created light. And what happened when God created light? Light created a separation. The Bible tells us that as soon as God created light, there is light and there is darkness. There is day and there is night. And out of this separation, it allows us to make some choices. That's what light does. Light opens your eyes to make it possible for you to see the changes and the choices that you need to make. But if you don't want to see, if you're not interested in seeing, then light is useless. And that was my experience with depression. Now, there are many of these lessons that I can share with you, of the things that I saw and I understood and I need to change. But I want to just focus on one thing this evening that I think is absolutely critical. It's absolutely the most important, the most bare bone foundation of mental health and mental wellness. 咁今晚其實我喺自己個生路歷程裏邊啦，呢個經歷咗個生路歷程裏邊，有好多嘅功課想同大家分享嘅。咁但係今晚因為想俾多啲時間大家去問問題咧，咁我只係想將個焦點咧擺喺最重要嗰一點個處因為呢一點咧就係我哋整個人嗰個嘅心理同埋精神健康咧最重要嘅一個嘅根基。The most important thing that you need to get right, the most important lesson that I learned that depression taught me, okay, the most critical thing that you need to have in order to live with mental and emotional wellness is that, you ready for this? You have to live with a healthy sense of self. You have to know who you are. You have to know what you want. You have to determine for yourself what is important to you. All right? And 或者呢一點咧，或者我應該用中文咧去同我哋當中做家長嘅講兩句説話。如果我哋今晚在座係有一啲係做家長嘅朋友咧，我覺得呢點我希望你今晚你乜都冇聽到嘅時候，我希望你能夠聽到呢一點。作為一個家長 ，as a parent，OK，你能夠俾到你嘅兒女最重要嘅功課，就係你要教導佢哋點樣去明白佢哋自己究竟係乜嘢嘅人。The most important gift as a parent that you can give to your child and your children is to help them to understand who they are, not what you want them to be, not what your church or your friends think they should be. 大家聽明我講乜嘢？作為家長，你最重要能夠俾到你嘅兒女最重要嘅一個功課就係佢哋要去發掘到究竟佢係一個乜嘢嘅人，佢係邊個，乜嘢令到佢快樂，佢想要喺生命裏面得到啲乜嘢，你要幫到佢去明白佢哋係點一個乜嘢嘅人，唔係你想佢做乜嘢嘅人，唔係教會裏邊弟兄姊妹朋友覺得佢哋應該要做啲乜嘢嘢。They have to figure out who they are. Because here's the thing. Most of us as parents think that our job is to set up our children for success. Now, there's nothing wrong with success. Don't get me wrong. I like success too. But I have learned that it is far more important for me as a father to teach my children how to handle failure. Because in life, failure is a far better gift than success, because every failure is a gift that teaches you something important. But you can only unwrap that gift. You can only open that gift and receive that blessing and wisdom inside. The only way you can do that is if you know who you are and what your story is about. Because if you don't, when you live your life according only to what others think you should be or who you should be, when failure hits, the only thing that you would realize, the only thing that matters to you is this idea that, oh no, what are people going to say now that I have failed? Before depression hits me, I have never learned that lesson in my life. For all my years as a pastor, without me even realizing it, my life was about making sure that people approve of me, that people like me as a pastor, that they respect me, that they like my sermons on Sundays, and they like this image of a perfect person or perfect family that I have built up. The day that I was diagnosed with depression by my doctor in his office, the day that he prescribed for me antidepressant medication, do you know what the number one fear I had was at that point? I wasn't worried about the treatment or the effects of the drug or any long-term effects or any of those things. As I sat in his office, or the office of my doctor, as he told me that, Alfred, you have severe clinical depression, you need to take this medication and receive treatment. At that moment in time, when I have just received this potentially life-changing diagnosis that could change my life upside down, the only question I had in my mind, are you ready for this, was, what would the church think? Is that not messed up? That moment, that life-changing moment when I'm told that I have a serious illness and I have to deal with it and receive treatment, I wasn't hearing any of that. The only thing I heard, the only thing I was thinking in my mind was, oh no, what would the church think? And that is a product of years of me living, not knowing who I am, but just spending my years living seeking the approval of others. The only thing that matters was that people like me or my image and appearing well in front of people. I parked outside the Shoppers Drug Mart with that prescription in my hand that day. And I sat in that parking lot of Shoppers Drug Mart for almost an hour. I was scared to go in. Do you know why I was scared to go in? You know what I was thinking? I was thinking, what if I run into someone from the church? What would they think?喺我經歷抑鬱症呢10幾年，我學到最寶貴嘅功課就係我頭先同大家分享過一件事。生命裏邊最重要嘅一件事就係你要知道你係邊個，唔係人哋覺得你應該係邊個。唔係你喺人哋面前幾有面，你喺人哋面前係做得幾成功。我當醫生話俾我知我有抑鬱症嘅時候，我做咗20年牧師。喺呢20年裏邊，我生命最重要係乜嘢啊？就係人哋得到人哋嘅尊敬，得到人哋嘅愛戴。我要製造一個形象出嚟，等人哋覺得我好屬靈，我好掂。當我個醫生話俾我知 Alfred 你有抑鬱症嚴重，你要食藥嘅時候，我唯一聽到嘅喺個腦裏邊唯一諗到嘅個問題就係乜嘢呢？唔係食藥有冇呢個嘅副作用，唔係我要去接受一啲咩嘢嘅治療，唔係完全唔係呢啲。我唯一驚嘅咩？我話死啦！教會會點諗呢？我揸住嗰張抑鬱症嘅抗抑鬱症嘅藥，坐喺 shopper 坐喺藥房出邊坐住1個鐘頭，唔敢入去配藥，因為點解？我坐喺車裏邊不斷咁樣諗，如果撞到教會嘅人點算呢？ I was on a speaking tour through Western Canada, And that was at a point of one of my lowest point in my life. My relationship with my wife was falling apart. And I can't remember the exact itinerary right now, but I think I spoke in Calgary, and I went out to Vancouver to speak at a conference, and I was to swing back to speak in Edmonton on the way back to Toronto. My relationship with my wife at that point was so broken that after my Vancouver stop, she was going to fly home to Toronto without me. She wasn't going to, she said, forget this. You go to Edmonton, do whatever you do. I'm just going to go home. The only reason why she flew with me to Edmonton was because we couldn't get a ticket to fly her back to Toronto on such short notice. So we flew from Vancouver to Edmonton. We fought all the way, getting to the plane, on the plane, getting off the plane, getting our luggage, getting our rental car, fighting all the way, non-stop, fighting until I get to the venue where I will speak that night. We fought getting out of the car, fought walking up to the front door. At the moment when that front door opened and the organizer came out to greet me, you know what happens? It was like a switch came on. Hey, good to see you. Thank you for having me. You remember my wife Anna? It was like an act, right? As soon as that front door opened, the act was on. We had fought all the way from Vancouver to Edmonton, from the airport to the car, from the car to the venue, from the venue to the front door. As soon as someone sees us, as soon as we're in the spotlight, the act is on. Now, I know some of you listening to this, and I know that I'm not alone, right? Because before when I was a pastor, we talked about, how we look all together and well presented in church. And as soon as we get home, things is a different story, right? Well, what I've learned is that it doesn't even take the time to get home. As soon as you get into the car after church, it's a different story, all right? And when I reflect back on that episode of my life, I said to myself, what the heck am I doing? Why do I do this? What's the point? And all of that experience, it gave me a new understanding of one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And I'm going to close with this. Jesus told the story once. And he said, one day, there was this religious person, this Pharisee, and he went to church. And this Pharisee got to church, and he stood up in the middle of church, and he prayed this beautiful prayer to God. And he said, God, I thank you so much that I'm not like others, that I am a pious person. I'm devoted to you. I give money. I serve the poor. I did on and went. Beautiful prayer. And Jesus said, while the Pharisee was praying, there was this other guy, this tax collector guy, who was so ashamed of the stuff that he has done. He didn't even dare to go into church. Instead, he parked way back, far away from church. And he put his head down on the steering wheel, and he said, God, I can't go in and see you. Please have mercy for me. I'm a sinner. And Jesus said, guess who went home that night having his prayer heard by God? Now, I have preached on that story probably 50 times over 20 years when I was a pastor. Every time I preached on that story, I thought the point of the story was Jesus is saying, you have to learn to be humble. Do not be proud like the Pharisee. It wasn't until that experience of depression and my life spiraling down and losing everything, it wasn't until that experience that I've really finally see what is the point of that story. The point of the story, Jesus is not just saying, be humble, don't be proud. That story, my friends, is a mirror. And that mirror, what Jesus is trying to show us is that, you know what? We have, 249 people tonight. 249 of us, in our human nature, given the choice between being the Pharisee and being the tax collector, 249 of us will choose to be the Pharisee. We want to be respected. We care about how people see us. We want people to speak well of us. We want to have this image of having it all together. And the point of the story is that that's human nature, but that's not how God operates. 聖經裏邊耶穌講嗰個故事，我頭先分享我自己嘅趣事啦，唔係趣事嘅，大家都其實都唔使多講啦，大家都明白㗎啦嚇，你同我都相信都經歷過喺教會裏邊就好好先生、好好太太，係咪？一切都係好嘅，標準家庭翻到屋企咧，其實就係另外一回事㗎啦。其實唔使翻到屋企啊，上咗車已經另一回事㗎啦。翻完教會，咁耶穌會講呢個故事，咁咧就話佢有一日咧喺教會喎，咁有一個咧屬靈領袖，咪起身去祈禱啦。哇！犀利咯！呢個屬靈領袖，哇開聲祈禱嘅時候咧，就哇引經據典咁樣，哇好美麗一個禱告。哇！神啊，我真係要好感謝你，因為我呢樣又做得好，嗰樣做得好，我又好虔誠嘅人，我又捐錢，我又幫窮人嗰個嘢，一篇好。如果喺教會裏邊聽到篇個禱告嘅時候咧，相信好多弟兄姊妹，阿門阿門阿門，好有迴響噶啦。咁耶穌就話咧，同一時間咧喺教會門外邊個停車場，再過多2條街，個街尾有架車停咗喺度，裏面有個人。嗰個人坐喺架車裏邊就話：我冇面返教會。佢話：神啊，因為我有罪，我唯有坐喺度就係求你去乞求你開恩去可憐我呢個有罪嘅人。咁耶穌話：你估兩個禱告神聽到邊個禱告咧？咁樣。我做20年牧師，我呢一篇嘅經文我講到我唔知講過幾多次嘅。但係要經歷咗我喺抑鬱症嗰10年，將我生命完全嘅崩潰，去到一無所有、一無是處嘅時候，我先至明白到嗰篇經文其實耶穌講緊乜嘢。我以為以前耶穌就話嗱，嗰篇經文咩故事嗰個教導咩唔好驕傲，你哋要謙卑。但係其實嗰篇經文唔係咁簡單，個當中嗰個道理。其實嗰篇經文係一片嘅鏡，個鏡就俾咩咧？就係話耶穌話，其實我哋每一個人，你有得選擇嘅時候，你都情願做個法利賽嗰個人。你想喺人哋面前好好睇睇，風風光光，標準家庭、標準婚姻。冇問題，因為點解？因為我哋認為喺教會裏邊，我哋有一個文化嘅。恕我好誠實咁去講，我哋教會有一個文化係咧，係一個形象嘅文化，乜嘢都要外邊做得好就得噶啦。家醜唔好俾人知，口口聲聲就話我哋係相信。我哋嘅救恩係一個恩典，唔係我哋嘅為善去換翻嚟嘅。如果我哋真係咁相信恩典嘅一群人，點解我哋咁怕會俾人見到自己嘅軟弱呢？ If we are truly a people of grace that we say we are in the church, then why is it that we are so deathly afraid of people seeing our failures and our weakness and our ugliness? My journey with depression taught me this one simple thing. I'm not going to pretend anymore. I need to know who I am. I need to stop living for other people's approval. Whenever I do a concert, whenever I do a talk or something like this, quite often people would come up to me afterwards to chat. And they would share with me their struggles. Some of them are struggling with their marriage. Some are struggling with their mental health. Some different things, private things. And what saddens me is that every single one of them would end their sharing with me by saying this. They would say to me, Alfred, I'm so glad that I can talk to you because, we can't talk about this in church. 我每次開演唱會或者去做一啲呢類咁嘅講座嘅時候咧，咁之後都好開心啦，即係有啲嘅朋友會嚟揾我傾偈啦，咁有啲朋友就係睇過我本書，咁即係有機會同佢哋去聽佢哋嘅故事。咁當中其實好多唔同嘅分享啦，有啲係精神健康嘅問題，或者家庭嘅問題、婚姻嘅問題、子女嘅問題，角色即係好多唔同嘅掙扎。咁但係令我最覺得係傷心嘅就係呢啲嘅朋友每一次同我分享完之後都講同一句説話嘅，就係 Alfred， 我好開心能夠有機會同你去分享，因為你知啦，呢啲嘢喺教會唔講得㗎。咁我就有個問題就係喺教會唔講得，咁喺邊度講得呢？ If you can't talk about it in church, where are you supposed to talk about it? And if we truly want our church to be a place where people will feel safe to seek help with their mental illness issues or mental health issues, then we have to be a place where it is okay to not be perfect, where it is okay to have failed, where it is okay to struggle. And that's my reason for writing the book that I wrote. The book is about, my hope with the book is that let me tell you my struggles. Let me tell you the worst things I have done, just so that it's okay. It's okay for you to tell me what you're struggling with. So at the end of the day, like I said, I mean, we have another 3 hours. I can go on and on about other lessons that I've learned. But the most important lesson that I have learned that I am passing on to my children is this, and simply this. You have to know who you are. Don't let your life be defined by pleasing what other people want. Don't live your life by seeking other people's approval or keeping up with what other people think your life should be. Know who you are. Know what your story is. Know what you want. And from there, know the story that God is writing in your life. 好啦，咁9:05，咁頭先同弟兄姊妹準備嘅時候就話呢個時候咧，我哋就停落嚟啦。咁即係如果大家係有啲嘅 question 啦，或者啲嘅分享啊，咁喺呢個時候，咁我哋可以去進入嗰個環節啦。So I was instructed to stop at 9:05, so it's 9:05 right now. And so we're going to open up the floor to questions and sharing that you may have. And I think Sam is going to help us, sort this through. So Sam, back to you.
Thank you, Alfred, for sharing with us your experience. 多謝 Alfred 同我哋嘅分享。So I have a few questions I pulled from the chat, and it is from chronological order as I received them. First question is, how can we support our friends and brothers and sisters who are struggling as a bystander? How can we support those who are struggling with mental health issue? 我哋應該點樣同一啲我哋身邊喺呢度掙扎緊嘅弟兄姊妹或者朋友嚟到同行咧
？OK， 呢個係我應該用中文定用英文答啊 Sam？
Well, it's posed in English, so I suppose English.
Okay, so let's go with that. Great question. I don't know who asked this, so I can't refer to the person by name. But great question. A couple of things that I would, and this is a question that I get asked quite often. A lot of it depends on the nature of the mental health struggle that the person is going through and the severity of it. Right. Now, I'm not a medical professional. I cannot give medical advice, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't give technical, clinical psychiatrist advice either. But so the first thing, I think the most important thing is that the person needs to be properly diagnosed, because depending on the nature of the mental illness, the approach will be very different. So we need to know and make sure the person is getting the treatment that he or she needs. So that's number one. With mental illnesses, it is very common that a person would experience a combination of mental illnesses. So there is quite common for someone to struggle with depression and anxiety at the same time. It's common for someone to struggle with bipolar disorder and be wrestling with a bit of schizophrenia at the same time. So, and those kind of scenarios need to be sorted out by someone who's qualified to do it. So that's number one, right? Making sure, trying to get the person to the place where they can get properly diagnosed. I think that's number one. Now, as far as what you and I can do, I think one of the things that is important is that we need to realize our boundaries, right? We are not there to cure the person, right? And you know what? Let me share with you a little bit of a secret. As someone who lives with a mental illness, I'm not looking for you to cure me either, right? So don't feel bad that you don't know what to say or don't know how to help. But what really helps me is the sense of companionship, right? I when I'm on my, when I struggle with my down days, I need to know that when I'm with you, that it's okay that I'm not having a good day, right? That I'm in a very bad mood, that I may even want to push you away, but I need to know that you have made a commitment to stay with me, right? And I think that's a place where the church really can shine, because we are a communal faith, right? So as if we come together as a community and build that kind of culture that says, you know what, it's okay to not be perfect, and I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you. So the gist is, I suppose, is to continue to walk with them and to ensure
Yes.
they get the help that they need.
Yes.
Second question, have your experience, your life experience and your struggle with depression changed your perception on God and church?
Yes. And this is, this is a kind of thing I can speak, for hours on. Yes, it has. I think I'm trying to figure out how to best put it. I think one of the change that I have experienced is that God is a lot bigger than I thought He was, right? And I know a lot less about Him than I thought I did, right? That God doesn't necessarily just work in cut and dry ways, right? God, and to me, when I look back at Scripture and the biblical story, isn't that part of the story that don't and to me, part of the biblical story is God continuing saying to people, don't think that you have me figured out. Don't think you have me boxed in and say that I can only work in this way and I can only work there and I can only work through this person or that group of people. Isn't that a lot of Old Testament and New Testament, God working in ways and through people that really kind of confuse His own people? Like, what do you mean God can work through, Gentiles? And so I think that's part of the reason why I am engaged in, community services in my career right now. Because I feel that I found a place that is more closer to where I understand my faith as and my spirituality as. So I'm in a space where I'm very comfortable working with people of all religious backgrounds to do God's work, right? And I think that's something that I often challenge. Like, in my perspective, right, I am doing God's kingdom work when I work alongside with a Muslim colleague, or when I work alongside a Sikh colleague. One of my one of the things that I needed to do as I managed the center that I'm in right now is that my Muslim colleagues needed a place to pray during the day. And for me, it was to build a place of prayer where my Muslim colleagues can pray when they need to during the day. And so I think in a nutshell that is kind of where my faith is at. It's much less institutional, right? It's much more trying to see what God's doing, beyond the walls of a church or beyond my understanding. So it's a process of opening my eyes and just seeing how little I understood before, and seeing God work in different ways.
Thank you. The question is, well, how can one manage if one already have a self-esteem to know who one is and what one actually wants? And so as one who's depressed and have low self-esteem, how does one stay positive and know exactly how one wants? And along the same vein, there's a follow-up question is, I'll kind of summarize it. How can one go seek who one is and what one wants and how one should live without crossing the line as a Christian, being self-indulgent?
Okay, great question. And I can only share with you my experience and how it came about for me, right? So for me, the first part is a stripping away, right? So when I was sitting in the pit of the lowest point of my life, right? I mean, I've lost my career, I've lost my health, I have lost. I was on the verge of, probably losing my family, and at that moment, for me, what that process was a process of just stripping things away. Things that used to define me, that I was a successful pastor, that I had this perfect family, that I was invited, as a Christian academic and speaker to go over the place and giving lectures and speaking and so on. All these things that I thought gave me value were stripped away. Right. So, and the first step out of that was to realize that, hey, you know what? I've lost those things. I didn't die. I'm still here. Okay. So those things that I used to think defined me, or used to thought defined me, and used to thought that it was the most expensive or most important. Okay. So those things are gone, and I'm. One of the reasons why my editor chose the title "Among the Ashes" was the biblical image of sitting among the ashes of someone who is in mourning, right? So, and that's a biblical image. You've lost everything, like Job, right? Job lost everything, his wealth, his family, and all. And when Job's friends came upon him, he was sitting among the ashes, having lost everything. So at that point, it's like, okay. Now I got to figure out what is important. Okay, so then I go back to my relationships. I go back to my relationship with my parents. I go back to my relationship with my daughter. I only had one daughter at that point. I went back to my relationship with my wife, my family, and start to realize, okay, you have these responsibilities. This is part of your story. This is part of who you are. And you start from the core, right? At that point, I don't know if I would ever go back to church. I don't know if I would ever be a pastor again. And it was like, okay, those things don't matter anymore. Focus on what matters and start there. And so for me, it's about learning to be a father again. It's about thinking about my relationship with my father and my parents, and taking those learnings and slowly And I have to add that it is a process that takes time. For me, it was a 13-year journey. So it wasn't like I figured it out last weekend. I'm telling you this tonight, right? It's a 13-year journey of a lot of pain, right? That I still haven't completely gone through, right? But being honest with yourself, I think that's probably the most important part. I mentioned at the outset that I'm a triathlete, and part of the thing that drew me to triathlon is that there's an honesty to it, right? I mean, I train 6 days a week, swim 2 days, bike 2 days, run 2 days, and when I hit a training session, my coach would say, okay, you know what, tonight we're going to swim 2,500 meters, we're going to do 10 times 100 meters at this pace with 30 seconds rest, go. At the end of that evening, there's only two possibilities. You either did it or you didn't do it. It didn't matter what people think. It didn't matter how pretty you look in your swimsuit. It didn't matter how much people like you or not like you. It's all about self-honesty. And I think that's my place that I needed to start. And it's after 13 years, it's still something I am processing and figuring out. I had a bit of not an advantage, but some of you know that my older daughter was an orphan that we adopted from China, right? And Taylor was abandoned on the streets of China on the day she was born, and it was a cold day in November. There was this newborn baby being left on the street with nothing on her except a little note that says, "This baby was born today." And Taylor was lucky that the police found her in time, took her to hospital, revived her, took her to an orphanage, and when Taylor was 10 months old, we adopted her as our daughter. And when Taylor came here, because I'm a hockey player, so I raised her as a hockey player. And I remember one day when Taylor was about 10 years old, I was watching her play hockey. And I had a flashback, and I thought, you know what? 10 years ago, on the day Taylor was born, and she was abandoned, naked, as a newborn baby on the streets of China, how many people would bet on that day that 10 years later, this little girl is going to be playing ice hockey in Toronto, Canada? And so Taylor's life, is an inspiration to me. And going back to what I said earlier on in my talk, there is a story that God is working with you and I to write. And our job is to keep writing that story and not quitting until that story is done. So those are, the bits and pieces of, how I started on this journey and the journey that I'm still on. Like I said, it's been 13 years and I'm still trying to figure it out. So it's a long time.
So I suppose to have a keen sense of how our story fit in God's big picture.
Sure.
It's part of it.
Yeah.
The next question, I believe you have already touched on a bit in your comment. The question was, besides medication, what other ways is best for us to cope when we are being hit with these depression episodes? And you mentioned sport, but I think that's one of it. But any suggestion?
Yeah. Let me say just a quick word about medication. Right. A lot of people have a lot of misunderstanding about what medication is supposed to do. Right, and a lot of people say, when I was first diagnosed and I was put on medication. I was on medication for roughly 2 years, if I remember correctly. I had a lot of friends who immediately said to me, "No, don't take, don't take it. There's tons of side effects, and you're going to be all messed up and and there were a lot of well-meaning friends." That say, "Oh, you know what? You just gotta have more faith as a Christian and allow God to heal you and don't rely on medication." So what I would say is that antidepressants are not happy pills. All right, it's not like you take a pill and then you just become happy. What medication did for me was to reestablish my brain chemistry so that I could understand and process the counseling I was being given at that time. And so for me, it was a combination of medication, counseling therapy, and finding that activity that takes you to that honest place. I think that, and it doesn't have to be sport, right? It could be writing, it could be art, it could be, whatever it is, right? But it has to be a space where it's just you and yourself, and you got to be honest with what you're seeing. And I think out of that comes, for me, out of that came a lot of that the lifestyle changes that I started implementing. So I'm a triathlete, so that's one thing. I'm a vegetarian, and I found that has been really, really helpful just physically. I quit drinking alcohol a few years ago, and that was very, very helpful. So it's a jigsaw puzzle of many, many, many different pieces fitting together. And depending on who you are, your jigsaw puzzle is going to be different. So,
next question. Suppose I should post it in Chinese. 請問你嗰本書有冇中文版？
有。咁就好，其實係一個好開心嘅過程嚟嘅。咁嗰本書出咗之後咧，咁就有兩位嘅學者就嚟接觸過我，咁就因為佢哋呢兩位咧就係都係好有資歷嘅學者，咁就用咗其中即係經過同意之後，就用咗其中一啲嘅內容，就翻譯咗去中文，就喺佢哋一本嘅著作裏邊咧，喺中國大陸出版咗嘅。咁喺嗰件事就知嗰個接觸之後咧，咁就有朋友同我喂，不如你出一本中文版啦咁樣。咁我哋係出版過一本中文版嘅，咁但係咧，因為我哋只係限量版咁做過印過一版啊。咁我自己其實而家都唔知道其實賣晒未。我自己本身就好少有幾本我自己留翻做自己嘅紀念啊咁樣啦。我去做一啲嘅資料搜集然之後或者我 email 翻俾阿 Candy， 即係如果我知道當我哋出版嘅時候咧，喺多倫多一間嘅福音書室咧係代理咗去賣嘅。咁但係咧，我哋係印咗好少嘅量，咁所以我都唔知道係賣成點。咁但係我做一啲嘅 research， 然之後我話翻俾大家知。
Okay. Next question about stigma in mental health. Do you feel the stigma of mental illness affecting you after all these years? And if so, how do you deal with it? Do you think it would trigger you with another episode of depression?
Good question. I think the stigma associated with mental health， 即係中文我哋所謂啲嘅歧視啦，係咪？I think it still exists, and let me say this. If you go back, I mean, I'm thinking back to, let's say, the Chinese church now, because that's our context for tonight, right? If you go back 10 or 15 years, it was never really a topic that gets discussed much in the Chinese church, right? And what we saw was, as the years went by, there were more talk about it, right? And so now there is a little more understanding, there's a little more awareness of it. But my concern is that our acceptance, it hasn't improved to a point where the church is a safe place for people who live with mental illness. See, what happens at times is that you have conversation. You get to a point where people know that, okay, you know what, it's not politically correct to say certain things, all right? And you get to that point, and what happens is that then that conversation seeps into the soil, right? People are still having, stigma attitudes. People are still having, misunderstanding about what mental illness. It's just that they don't talk about it now. So to answer that question, yes, I mean I do encounter stigma with it in terms of when I share with people about my issue and the fact that I live with depression, quite often people won't know what to do with me. It's like, oh no, like, is it okay for me to talk to him? Am I gonna really send him off onto another episode? So that's part of my passion. That's part of my commitment to keep talking about it. For people to see that, hey, I'm a regular human being, just like you and just like her. It's just that I happen to live with an illness that sometimes require me to manage things a little more carefully, and that's the key, right? Like, it's like someone with diabetes, right? It's like someone with heart problems. You learn to manage it, right? It's really no different than that.
Thank you. And everybody, I'm afraid that will be our last question of the night. Thank you, Alfred.